How's it going, everyone? I'm Town Cape, and today I'm going to have to do a bit of a detour on narrative mechanics. This episode was originally going to be on Dragon Age Inquisition, but I underestimated how long the game was, so it will take some time for that episode to come out. In the meantime, I'd like to examine the concept of video game storytelling in relation to Telltale's video games. I'll be exploring how storytelling has traditionally been done through the ages, what makes storytelling in video games really stand out, and how these techniques are implemented in both The Walking Dead and The Wolf Among Us. In recent years, Telltale has created some of the most well-received narrative-driven games, but their products still aren't free of criticisms. One of the primary complaints about Telltale's games is that they aren't games. Since there are minimal mechanics and heaps of cutscenes, critics have labeled Telltale's products as interactive movies rather than games. I'd like to address this issue in regards to video game storytelling. I think most people can agree that what makes the storytelling of any medium important hinges on what makes that specific medium unique. Books can only rely on words, so they can only rely on textual storytelling. Films, on the other hand, have more space. They can rely on textual storytelling, but they can also rely on cinematic storytelling. However, they usually rely on cinematics rather than text dumps because cinematic storytelling is what makes films stand out from books. However, games have always struggled to find their narrative identities, but there have been some great games that have underlined just what makes games their own storytelling mediums: interactivity. The primary aspect of a game that makes it stand out is its gameplay mechanics. Gameplay mechanics can't be found in any other medium, so ideal video game storytelling should hinge on interactive storytelling. Of course, I'm not saying that we can't have text to read, music to listen to, and also camera angles to watch, but they shouldn't be the main storytelling methods implemented in games because they can be found in all the other mediums. Most games have plenty of mechanics in them, but a common issue is that their mechanics aren't used to help tell the story. In the past, when games told stories, they used to spiral between being a game and being a novel. Nowadays, games have become much bigger budget, and that has allowed them to move from copying books to copying films, primarily through cutscenes. I don't think games have evolved to a point that they can completely avoid cutscenes yet, but still, the amount of cutscenes in the average story-driven game is a bit too much. I think the reason for this is because in general, games seem to have trouble making their mechanics meaningful in a narrative sense. Games know how to make their mechanics fun, but just because something is fun doesn't mean it's meaningful. This brings us to what makes Telltale games stand out: their meaningful mechanics. True, Telltale's games have minimal mechanics, but they're minimal, meaningful mechanics. Practically every single mechanic in a Telltale game aids the storytelling of the game in some way, shape, or form. But what makes the mechanics of their games stand out is that unlike most games, they work complementary with the cutscenes. Yes, there are a lot of cutscenes, but if these cutscenes work with the gameplay, they can achieve something that film cannot. What I'm basically saying is that cutscenes can become an essential part of narrative-driven games as long as they're made meaningful by working together with the mechanics. So far, The Walking Dead is probably the best example of how to get cutscenes to work with gameplay. It's true that cutscenes are non-interactive by nature, but sometimes the non-interactivity can be used to make a point. Due to the minimal interactivity, cutscenes are relaxing by nature. By limiting the input required from a player, cutscenes, particularly the conversations, do help create this feeling of ease. However, this feeling of ease is just a ploy. The Walking Dead has always been a story about soothing the audience into their comfort zone and immediately kicking them out. When players are thrown into gameplay, it's often in a tense situation, and it's right after a relaxing cutscene. This really captures the comfort-shattering tension of The Walking Dead in a way that only a video game can. When cutscenes throw us into gameplay, it's usually either in a QuickTime event or a dialogue tree. Since these are designed to immediately push us out of our comfort zone, they rely on creating this sense of urgency. You're relaxing, but now you have to quickly push this button combination if you want to stay alive. You're relaxing, but now you have to make this tough decision for your group. It's true that dialogue options aren't exclusive to intense situations, but there's always at least some sense of urgency to them. The Walking Dead presents a world which is losing its humanity, so you always feel the urgency to respond to even the tiniest human conversation. However, gameplay isn't the only thing that creates a sense of urgency. Cutscenes do that as well. Since they take away control from the player, they're an effective tool for communicating the powerlessness of a player in intense situations. Human beings aren't the decisive heroes that we see in traditional power fantasies. In real life, humans do things on reflexes and lack of thought when they throw in high-intensity situations. Cutscenes are an effective device for communicating how our will to survive robs us of complete control of our body. But the important thing is that despite all these cutscenes, they don't really dictate the flow of the game. The most important decisions of the games are always left to the gameplay. Is something strange going on in the area? Well then, investigate it yourself. Should this person or that person be saved? Decide yourself. So Telltale adopts this quality over quantity approach. They believe that the quality of the gameplay is better than the quantity. Now some people would argue that high quality gameplay always involves complex combos, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that what constitutes high quality gameplay in a story-driven game depends on what story is being told. The Walking Dead is just a story about regular people. These aren't some highly trained assassins, they're just simple everyday people. So I think it makes sense that the mechanics of this game are just simple everyday mechanics. Speaking of mechanics, now let's turn to The Wolf Among Us. I think it did a good job at bridging its mechanics and narrative, but I don't think it did it as well as The Walking Dead. The first episode of The Wolf Among Us was originally supposed to come out shortly after the first episode of The Walking Dead, but it got delayed until the end of the following year because Telltale wanted to focus on The Walking Dead. Telltale claimed they wanted to learn from The Walking Dead's success and use it to improve The Wolf Among Us. And there's no doubt that they did that. For starters, The Wolf Among Us has less cutscenes and more investigation scenes. This makes sense because this is the murder mystery. Giving the player a chance to play detective is a must. There are also more dialogue trees, and that makes sense because questioning is an integral part of being a detective. So Telltale didn't just copy The Walking Dead when they created The Wolf Among Us. They made sure that The Wolf Among Us had its own narrative identity. But I still don't think this narrative identity is as strong as The Walking Dead for a number of reasons. For starters, The Wolf Among Us's mechanics are as simple as the ones in The Walking Dead. But this isn't a story about regular people anymore. Bigby is a sheriff, so I think it would make more sense if there were at least a bit more complex mechanics. The cutscenes have always been a bit of a head-scratcher for me. The Wolf Among Us isn't a story that tries to ease you into your comfort zone and immediately kick you out. It's a murder mystery. So how do all these cutscenes fit in? Well, the best answer I've heard is that the cutscenes are used to aid the story of Bigby rather than the greater story. Throughout the game, we hear about how Bigby had a dark past and committed heinous actions. His job as his sheriff is his redemption, and the cutscenes are supposed to aid this. In order to understand this argument, let's look at a similar story in GTA 4, Nico's story. Part of Nico's story involved this.
12 people died, 3 escaped.
However, about 5 minutes earlier, you could get him to do this. See what I mean? Since many games are about player empowerment, it's often difficult to execute a story for a character that is seeking redemption for the misuse of their power in the past. I mean, if that really is the story arc you're going with, then you need to design the game in such a way that it's not possible for the character to misuse their power, even if the player wants them to. It seems that Telltale addressed this issue by relying on cutscenes. Cutscenes restrain gameplay, and that can be used to make a point about Bigby. By restraining the control that the player has over Bigby, Telltale conveys how Bigby has learned to restrain himself in a way that only a video game can. However, I feel Telltale didn't implement this design as well as they could have. I mean, if lack of control depicts restraint in Bigby, then why isn't the player given more control over him when he loses his restraint? Bigby never kills innocent people in the game, but he can kill bad guys like the Crooked Man and Tweedledum. But Bigby isn't supposed to kill anyone, so whenever he kills someone, it's supposed to depict him losing his restraint. But it doesn't depict him losing his restraint in a way that only a video game can. We're not given any more control over Bigby when he kills someone than when he doesn't kill someone. I'm aware that Telltale is using a dated engine, but I do believe it wouldn't have been impossible for them to give more control over Bigby to the player. A more complex quick-time event sequence could have done the trick. While Telltale may not always have made the best decisions, it's still clear that they always try to make the most meaningful decisions. Sure, there are a lot of cutscenes in their games, but these cutscenes are meaningful, and there's little gameplay, but this little gameplay is meaningful. I don't think minimal gameplay means that Telltale games aren't games, but rather, I think minimal gameplay reflects the current state of gameplay in story-driven games. Even today, there just aren't many meaningful mechanics in story-driven games. So if you want to make a story-driven game exclusively with minimal mechanics, ironically, you may end up making a game with just a few mechanics. I mean, look at the walking mechanic, one of the most popular mechanics in story-driven games. How meaningful is it? When video games were first able to craft virtual worlds, the chance to explore them was fascinating. But nowadays, the novelty has just worn off. Many games give you an opportunity to skip walking through entire areas because the mechanic has just become tedious as the game goes on. I think cutscenes in Telltale games do a better job at communicating transition than walking from point A to point B ever did. Don't get me wrong though, I'm not saying Telltale knew all of this in advance and implemented it in their games. I know that their engine doesn't allow them to do much, but intentional or not, there's no denying that their engine provides them with a storytelling style that works very well in their recent video games. Sure, it works better with some than with others, but it still does a good job overall. Remember guys, these are all just my opinions. Anyway, thanks everyone for watching. Next narrative mechanics will be on Tales from the Borderlands. I'll see you guys next time. Have a great day.